God to the rescue, Moses and the great escape from Egypt. Exodus 3 through 13. Joseph and his brothers grew old and they died. But their children's children stayed on in Egypt, where they became a very large family. Later on, a new king began to rule, but this Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph, and he didn't like God's people. He made them into his slaves. And he beat them, and he made them work harder and harder every day. God's people cried out to God to rescue them, and God heard them. He remembered his promise to Abraham. He would look after his people. He would find a way to set them free. One day, Moses was looking after his sheep when something caught his eye. A bush was behaving very oddly. A flickering of flames was in the bush, but its leaves weren't burning up. He took a closer look. "Moses!" boomed a big voice. Moses leapt back. The bush was talking to him. "I have heard my people's cries," God said. "I have seen their tears, so I have come down to rescue them. Go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go free." Moses was afraid, but God said, "I will be with you." So Moses went to Pharaoh. "Pharaoh," Moses began, "God says." "God?" said Pharaoh. "I've never heard of him." Moses kept going. "God says, let his people go free." "Why should I?" Pharaoh said. "I don't want to, and I won't." So he didn't. So God gave Pharaoh 10 warnings called plagues. First, God turned the river Nile into blood. No one could drink the water, but still Pharaoh would not let them go. So God made frogs come hopping and leaping and jumping in their bed, in their hair, in their soup. It was frogs everywhere. "Make them go away," Pharaoh screamed, "and then your people can go." So God took the frogs away. But Pharaoh changed his mind. "You can't go," he said. Then God sent zillions of gnats, but still Pharaoh said no. So then God sent swarms of flies bugging and buzzing around in your eyes, flies. And after that, sickness and horrible boils and huge hailstones and a swarm of locusts. Then darkness when it should have been daytime, until it seemed that the whole world, all of creation and everything was coming undone, falling back into darkness and emptiness and nothingness. But each time, Pharaoh said, "Make it stop, and I will let them go." And each time when God made it stop, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, "Actually, no, I've decided you can't go." Finally, Moses warned Pharaoh, "Obey God, or he will have to send the worst thing of all." But Pharaoh just laughed. So God said, "The oldest boy in each family of Egypt must die, but my people will be safe." God told his people to take their best lamb to kill and to put some of its blood on their front doors. And when God passes over their house, Moses explained, God will see the blood and he will know that the lamb died instead of you. So that night it was just as God said it would be. Suddenly, piercing the darkness, echoing down the corridors of the palace, came a blood-curdling scream. Pharaoh's oldest son had died. At last, Pharaoh did what God said. "Get out," Pharaoh shouted. "Just go." And so, that very night, Moses and God's people fled out of Egypt and out of slavery. They were free at last. God's people would always remember this great rescue, and they would call it Passover. But an even greater rescue was coming. Many years later, God was going to do it again. He was going to come down once more to rescue his people. But this time, God was going to set them free forever and ever.